Hey there, church leaders. I hope you're doing well today. My name is Wilson McCoy with the College Hills Church of Christ here in Lebanon, Tennessee, and I just want to welcome you to ACU Summit 2020 Virtual Edition. As you probably know by now, ACU Summit is completely online this year, but we're still trying to offer some resources to you. And our particular pathway that myself and Eric Gentry will be leading is what we're calling a congregational leadership pathway. And so we're taking this big theme of Summit, which is Blessed are the Peacemakers, and we're trying to think about what that looks like in our local churches. What does it look like for ourselves as church leaders and our communities of faith to prioritize peace and unity? And this particular session is going to be a conversation with Doug Foster about some historical precedent for peace and unity in our particular stream, and also what it might look like to recover some of those things. So I want to turn it over to Eric to let him introduce himself and then introduce our speaker for this session.
Hey friends, my name is Eric Gentry. I'm the preaching minister at the Highland Church of Christ in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm thankful to be part of this pathway and thankful for Wilson's leadership in it as well as the Summit office and everything they've done in these strange times to still make Summit a possibility and this great content available to you all. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Dr. Foster for a long time. I love Dr. Foster dearly. I know Wilson does as well. Dr. Foster was a professor for both of us in the area of church history. He's now a scholar in residence at ACU, working primarily in church history, also with the Carl Spain Center. And as I have observed Dr. Foster in his semi-retirement, he still seems to be very busy. And part of nearly every conference I attend, I hear a lecture from Dr. Foster. He's blessed my church here in Memphis personally before, and I think you'll be blessed by him today. He's talking to us on, as Wilson said, a commitment to peace and unity that we find in our movement from its earliest days, and one that I think is important for us to consider in the modern context. This is something he's been working on since the days of his dissertation, which was on the struggle for unity during the period of division in the Restoration movement. So this is something he's been thinking about for a long time. He's the author of numerous books, including a brand new biography on Alexander Campbell, A Life of Alexander Campbell, that came out this summer. Dr. Foster, we've been looking forward to this, and I'll turn it over to you to begin a presentation. Afterwards, we're going to have a short conversation with Dr. Foster.
Thanks so much, Eric and Wilson. I really appreciate the invitation. And as Eric has said, both Eric and Wilson were former students of mine. I love them dearly and have kept up with their work as they've been in the trenches, so to speak, as leaders in churches in Tennessee and Memphis and Lebanon. And so it's great to be with you today. So let me just jump right into what I want to present, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers afterwards with the three of us. In a moment, I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see some of the presentation pictures and quotes that I want to really emphasize. But I'll start off by saying that it's true historically, as far as our movement is concerned, that a constant and consistent call for Christian unity has been part of the Stone Campbell movement since its beginning and up to the present. Sometimes people look at this movement, our part of the movement, Churches of Christ, and they don't think of Christian unity and they don't think of peace primarily right off the bat. And yet that has been consistently called for and an important part of what we have stood for throughout our history. And so what I'm going to do in this brief presentation is to highlight about 8 voices in the history of our movement and Stone Campbell movement generally, and in Churches of Christ specifically. So we'll start with a person that I guess in some ways articulated early on most extensively this commitment, this call to Christian unity, and that's Thomas Campbell. Thomas Campbell came to the U.S. in 1807 from Northern Ireland. Many of you who are watching this know a lot of the story, so I'm not going to go into great detail. But he worked against division in his own context back in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, but had a terrible situation as far as the divisions continued, and even the efforts to try and stop them were thwarted. came to America thinking it might be better. Hopefully it would be better here, but it wasn't. The divisions continued to be very strong here. To make a long story short, he and a group of others in Western Pennsylvania formed an organization they called the Christian Association of Washington, Pennsylvania, where he lived, close to where he lived. And they drew up a document. Thomas Campbell wrote the document, and they ratified it at a meeting that had a lot of things to say about who they were, what they were trying to do. But I'll just quote a couple of places. This is from 1809, the Declaration and Address of the Christian Association. Christians are bound by the highest and most endearing obligations to love each other as brethren. It's an obligation, even as Christ has loved them. He says a lot of folks are just sick and tired of the bitter jarrings and janglings of a party spirit, a divisive spirit. We want to be at rest. We want to be at peace. And we want to adopt measures that would give rest to our sisters and brothers throughout all the churches. And in one section, he has this really brilliant piece that I think shows some of that deep commitment. Christians, this is a section of 13 propositions, and many of you will know these as well. Christians should consider each other as the precious saints of God. Those who follow Christ should consider each other as the precious saints of God, should love each other as sisters and brothers, children of the same Father and family, temples of the same Spirit, members of the same body, subjects of the same grace, objects of the same divine love, bought with the same price, and joint heirs of the same inheritance. That phrase, bought with the same price, would become so powerful in even his son Alexander Campbell's thought. Whom God hath thus joined together, no man, no one should dare to put asunder. So he even evokes the marriage ceremony for that terminology. And this is at the very beginning of our movement. Another of the people who was very early on, even earlier chronologically than the Campbells, was Martin W. Stone. He was born in America, and he was also deeply committed to modeling as well as teaching peace and unity among followers of Christ. One of the key documents in our history is the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery, 1804. I'll just look at one paragraph from that document, and many of you will know this one as well. We will that preachers and people, the leaders and everybody else, cultivate a spirit of mutual forbearance, pray more, and dispute less. That's one of my favorite parts of that short document, the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery. Later on, Stone would write quite a bit about unity and peace among Christians. There was a short article in 1835 that I think really begins to capture some of the essence of his understanding of what it meant to strive for peace and unity. He was talking about some of his brothers and sisters who would hold up the Bible as the bond of union, and yet there wasn't a lot of union or unity taking place. And so he makes this judgment: the scriptures will never keep together in union and fellowship members not in the spirit of the scriptures, which spirit is love, peace, unity, forbearance, and cheerful obedience. This is the spirit of the great head of the body. I think that he's really getting at something absolutely essential here. You can see in that quote from 1835 an allusion to the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. If we're not characterized by the fruit of the Spirit, if we're not shaped in the image of Christ, you can have all the stuff right, supposedly. You can quote all the right passages, but it's not going to hold people together in union and unity. We skip to another generation. T.B. Larimore, a person who I grew up hearing about and loving in North Alabama. Of course, he died long before I was born, but his name and his influence was still powerful when I was growing up. I went to school at Mars Hill Bible School, which is a descendant, you can say, of a school that he established there at the same site in the 1800s. Larimore was living during the period of growing tensions in that first major division that would lead to the first major division in the Stone Campbell movement. And he was being pressed very hard to take a stand. He had become widely known as an evangelist, as an educator. He was a loving, godly person. The more people knew him, the more they loved him. They wanted him to come. He had so many invitations to do what we would call gospel meetings that he had to turn down at least half of them every year, especially during the time that he was running the school. And his reputation became so great that everyone knew about Brother Larimore, and everybody had a good impression, I guess you'd say, of Brother Larimore. But as the tensions grew, he simply did not talk about the issues that people were fighting about. And in 1897, one of his former students, after he had actually closed the school, asked him, O.P. Spiegel was the name of the student, asked him, take a stand. Give us what you think about these issues, Brother Larimore. Everybody knows you. Everybody listens to you. Everybody respects you. You need to speak out on these things. And you owe it to the fellowship of our churches to say something. Well, he wrote a long reply. The original challenge, I guess you'd say, came in an article that was published in the Christian Standard. And he wrote a reply and sent it to the Gospel Advocate, the Christian Standard, and the Christian Evangelist, three of the major papers then, and they all published it. And part of what he said was this: while thousands have stood before me, hand in mind, and made the good confession, as we call it when we are about to baptize someone, I've never questioned one of them about these matters. The things that were dividing people, the churches, Christians, they're just not part of what's the essence of what we're about. Shall I now renounce and disfellowship all of those who do not understand these things exactly as I understand them? He went on to say also, they may refuse to recognize or fellowship or affiliate with me, and the caps are in the original, but I will never refuse to recognize or fellowship or affiliate with them. Never. This is an attitude. This is about what it means to be shaped into the image of Christ. It's what it means to be, as Martin Stone was talking about, characterized by those fruits of the Spirit of love and joy and peace. And that was powerful for those who heard it, although it did not stop the division and the strife. The next person I want to mention, and I'll say this again in a moment, I've just chosen some representative voices. If you wanted to do this, you could find hundreds and hundreds of voices during the periods that we're talking about, as well as other periods later, that would be saying some of the same kinds of things. G.C. Brewer became one of the most widely known preachers in churches of Christ. Now we've moved to the period when the movement has divided. And he would be identified very clearly with churches of Christ for the most part. But he was one of the most respected voices in that part of the movement once the division took place. Although he continued to have connections with and conversations with people in the Christian church's disciples. He wrote a book that, if I'm not mistaken, is actually still in print by the Gospel Advocate Company, called The Model Church. And again, it was sort of a compilation of ideas about the structure, the polity, we might call it, of what the church should look like, how it should be organized, the things that we should do, and we have our services, etc. And it became very influential. And I think that if you were to characterize most of the book, it would be, again, those things that focuses on getting the right structure with the right leadership, elders and deacons and evangelists, and having the Lord's Supper every Sunday and worshiping without instruments. Those would be the things that I think would be the bulk of the book. And yet he comes to the end of the book, and there's this brilliant chapter where he basically says, okay, you can have all that stuff, But if you don't have something else, it's not going to be a true church. It's not going to be a model church. And so he begins describing, and that whole chapter goes into much more detail, but this is part of what he said. They will in honor prefer one another. They will all be members of one another. They will bear one another's burdens. They will weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. There will be no schism, division in the body, but love will be without hypocrisy among them. It's just striking to me how this person who was so widely respected and so in many ways kind of set a tone for what our churches would look like as the division was finishing up, was still aware, like Stone was and the others that we've quoted, that unless you are shaped into the image of Christ, unless you are loving each other, unless you are focusing on the things that are most important in the life, in the spiritual life, you're not going to have a model church. You're not going to have a church that's really like it should be. The next person I'll mention may be less known by many of the ones who will be listening to this. His name was N.L. Clark. N.L. Clark. This man was a leader, I guess you could say, among the part of the churches of Christ that became known eventually as the non-Bible class churches of Christ. The part that were opposed to Sunday schools. And so they believed that dividing the church into various groups and separating them and everybody sort of having their own little group was contrary to the unitive nature of the church and even of the passing on of the faith from the older to the younger and so forth. And I think that there's some strong points that are there even today in some of the intergenerational classes that are being done and advocated in churches. And they didn't always do it to the best. And again, that divisive spirit creeps in on any good point, I guess you could say. And he was a leader and was the actual editor of one of the main papers of the non-Bible class churches, the Apostolic Way. But he writes an article, again, he's being sort of pressed to disfellowship, I guess you'd say, those who continue to have Sunday school classes, the class churches they call them. And he says, it's evident that Christians may differ and yet be brethren. May we expect to find congregations of Christians all alike? I answer no. The idea that people should separate because they disagree has been the prolific source of all the divisions that have cursed the church. The idea that people should separate because they disagree. He never made this a term of renouncing those who continued to use classes in their church services, in their church operation. He always advocated that this was something that was his belief, was the thing that they should practice, that he believed they should practice, but he never made it a divisive issue. Now, again, this next person might be, let me go back to the photo, might be a person that's less known among many in our churches, but this was one of the most important African-American leaders in our churches at the end of the 19th century and through the 1930s, as you can see on his birth and death dates. Lived in Nashville, Tennessee for much of his ministry career, Preston Taylor. He was one of the most important leaders among Black disciples during this period of time. He baptized Marshall Keeble. Marshall Keeble would eventually, of course, be identified with churches of Christ rather than disciples. Taylor was more identified and remained more identified with the disciples part of the movement. But after the division that began to take place, which manifested itself among Black disciples as well, he was very concerned about the divisions that were in place between white Christians and Black Christians. He couldn't fight against single-handedly and do away with those social systems that were so powerful, so oppressive, so in place. But he also was as a disciple, very interested in organizing Black disciples to work together, to do mission work, to produce materials to help in their education and so forth, and was actually one of the wealthiest men, especially for the Black population of Nashville of his day, and helped that community in many, many ways. In 1917, he actually organized it's called the National Christian Missionary Convention. The National Christian Missionary Convention. Anytime you see the word national in an organization in this period, before or after, even until the 20th century, it usually indicates a Black organization. Many of the white organizations had already had the word American as part of their name. So in many cases, Blacks took the word national to identify their organizations. And so in 1917, he organized the National Christian Missionary Convention. They had their inaugural meeting in Nashville, and he spoke to the group as far as the beginning of that movement, that convention. And there were a lot of white leaders from disciples that were in the audience that day. And he has a part of that inaugural address where he addresses the whites specifically. You can see part of what he says here. The disciples of Christ, strange as it may seem, he's speaking to the whites now, need the colored people, if for no other reason as the acid test of Christian orthodoxy and willingness to follow the Christ all of the way in his program of human redemption. For if the white brother can include in his religious theory and practice the colored people as real brothers, he will have avoided the heresy of heresies. The heresy of heresies that he's talking about is that separation and that subordination by the white population and even white Christians of their Black brothers and sisters. Another example of this is R.N. Hogan. R.N. Hogan was one of the great leaders among Black churches of Christ in the 20th century. He was an educator, he was an evangelist, he was a writer. For many, many years, the main paper among Black churches of Christ was the Christian Echo. I found this really, really powerful article that Hogan wrote in 1989, I should say. This is part of it. We not only receive the grace of God in vain when we fail to work together, and he's talking about across the races as well as among all Christians in churches of Christ. We receive the grace of God in vain when we fail to work together, but our work is in vain. If we don't have that unitive, peaceful spirit, there's one body, and there must never be any schisms, divisions in the body of Christ, which is the Church of Christ. And then one other from more recent times in churches of Christ. This is Jack Evans Jr. Jack Evans Jr. is the son of Jack Evans, the late Jack Evans, who was longtime president of Southwestern Christian College, the only historic Black college university in churches of Christ. And he has, again, an article in the Christian Echo, 1986, Jesus Christ in Black and White. The day may never come that societal racism becomes null and void, but the day must come, will come, and is coming when we all will have to realize that Jesus Christ is the same in black and white. Surely, if we expect to sing praises together around the throne of God in heaven, we need to start practicing together down here. These are the voices that I've chosen to sort of look at briefly this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're watching. There are a lot of others from our heritage that we could focus on, that we could talk about, we could quote from. These people from the Stone Campbell movement and churches of Christ have made powerful statements about the centrality of unity among Christians and about the profound need we have for each other. Each of the statements we've looked at gives inspiration and motivation for pursuing unity between and among sisters and brothers in Christ. There's a deep commitment to unity running through the entire history of this movement. But I think I need to say something else at this point. We've got to be aware of some unstated assumptions behind most of these calls to live out Christ's call for unity among his followers. Even within such powerful expressions, there were barriers to unity, barriers to peace in the minds of speakers and hearers. And I think these speakers probably took it for granted that everyone who was reading what they wrote or hearing what they said understood that these scriptural calls for the visible unity of all Christ's followers were limited. And so while it's true there is a deep commitment to unity running throughout the entire history of the Stone Campbell movement, it's also true that the speakers took it for granted that everyone understood such calls for the visible unity of all Christ's followers to be limited. And so you see, for example, Thomas Campbell, when he wrote, he's writing to say Protestants. He's certainly not including those who would not be among what we call Protestant churches. You can see this in some of his other writings. Sometimes those statements are meant for immersionists only, people who practice immersion. I think Alexander Campbell might be one of those, although he's sometimes mixed in that. Sometimes people, I think like Larimore during that period of the division of the Stone Campbell movement, may have simply been saying we need to have unity within this context. Peace and unity within the Stone Campbell movement. That's the boundary that may be there with him. I think that we might have to say that with Brewer and Hogan and Evans, it is churches of Christ. It may even be certain kinds of churches of Christ that they're thinking in terms of, although with Hogan and Evans, you definitely have that sense of the evil of black and white separation among Christians. And then, quite frankly, in many cases, I think, especially when you look at several of the folks we've quoted, it would have been taken for granted in many ways that the separation between blacks and whites should remain in place, even though that is a major, major blow, visible blow to the unity of Christ's church. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of our congregations, as well as congregations across the nation, remain made up of one race primarily. This is a quote from a book that's just come out this year. It's a really powerful book. I would recommend anyone to read this. Robert Jones's White Too Long. After centuries of complicity, the norms of white supremacy have become deeply and broadly integrated into white Christian identity, operating far below the level of consciousness. And yet, I want to close with this statement. Even though if we realize that each of these people had certain limitations, whether they were explicitly stated or not, as far as the boundaries of where Christian unity, where peace should be sought, I guess you could say in some ways. In the light of the fullness of God's kingdom, these statements still have the power to transcend those assumed limitations, or in some cases unexamined limits that we place on God's vision. I would really love it if we could heed the truth that was stated by Barton Stone that we saw early in 1835. The scriptures will never keep together in union and fellowship members not in the spirit of the scriptures, which spirit is love, peace, unity, forbearance, and cheerful obedience. This is the spirit of the great head of the body. I'm so glad that we could look at some of these ideas today, and maybe we can spend a little bit of time now in conversing and with questions and answers.
Yeah, taking notes while you were lecturing, Dr. Foster. I was having flashbacks to grad school, so it's been a while. It's been a while since I've done that. Let me start with a question that is where you started as kind of a side comment, but I think it's important. It goes to the misunderstanding of our roots as a movement. If someone has had your class, then they obviously have a different view of our roots, but I think that you are right in a lot of people's misunderstanding of who we as a movement were initially intended to be. And that thread runs throughout, which you demonstrated, but sometimes that thread gets missed or those roots get overlooked. And I'm just curious of why, and how we understand our history really does shape how we move forward. So why do you think that that's a thing that we can often miss about our history and that gets overlooked?
Well, I asked myself the same question a lot. And again, I don't think there's a quick and easy answer. I can say some things about what happened and maybe make some judgments or surmise maybe what was going on. I think that it's true, while the two pieces of our movement, restoration and unity, were very much tied to each other early on. Restoration of the ancient gospel and order of things, to use Campbell's terminology, was sort of the way you were going to get to unity, because the assumption was, when everybody sees this, it's just so patently clear, they'll all say, oh, wow, why didn't we see this before? And they'll come together. There's all Christians will come together in unity. Again, that was pretty naive, because the assumption was that the factual doctrinal propositions and the practices and the polity, the structure, that everybody in the history of Christianity had always seen it and understood it in exactly the same way. And that once it was explained clearly again today, getting rid of all the things that had sort of become attached to the church through the centuries, that people will be able to see it, because rational people will be able to understand this. We're the rational ones here. We can see it. And everybody else has the capability of doing that as well. The problem was, and I think it comes up in some of the quotes that I've just talked about, this is assuming that the bottom line of what makes one a true Christian is having all the right doctrinal propositions in your head, assenting to them. In other words, it's about us using our intellectual abilities. And as you know, I certainly encourage using intellectual abilities. You were both my students. But the assumption is, and it's not even stated, that that's the point, that the bottom line is having precisely articulated doctrinal propositions and about the church, its structure, about the beliefs and practices. And that's what certifies you as a true Christian, as a true church. And I don't think that's true. I think that what certifies you, and Campbell even says it one time, although he in some ways backs off of it, what certifies you as a Christian is being shaped in the image of Christ. And with Stone's terminology, using the fruit of the Spirit, I think alluding to the fruit of the Spirit in that quote from 1835, being characterized by peace and patience and forbearance and love, as opposed to the work of the flesh, also in Galatians chapter 5, where people are bickering and fighting and practicing all sorts of things of divisive and hurtful to human nature and so forth. So, in my opinion, what I think happened was that people were so intent on getting doctrines and practices correct, having things articulated precisely and holding them, assenting to them, following through, that became the bottom line. That was what counted. rather than being transformed into the image of Christ. And I think doctrine is important, but again, it's not an end in itself, in my opinion. I think it's as we struggle with, as we think about, as we try to fathom the depths of Christian doctrine, like the atonement, what Christ did for us, of God's love for us, of the love of Christ for the church, and on, that in that process, if we are humble, that's where we're being shaped more into the image of Christ. And being in Scripture, it's not a matter of us, I've said this in other occasions, it's not a matter of us mastering it intellectually. The Scriptures are not for our mastering. Are there facts there that we need to know? Well, yeah, I think that there is. But the reason we need to be immersed constantly in Scripture is not for our intellectual stimulation primarily, but for being there where the Spirit, for the sword of the Spirit, whatever you want to call it, can shape us, can transform us into the image of Christ. And I think that's where the problem comes. When people get focused more on the doctrinal propositions, the practices, as being the bottom line, as being the point of it all, and trusting in their own intellectual abilities to get it all right, I think some of the unitive pieces become sort of out the window.
Dr. Foster, can I jump in there and tack on to that? That's so helpful. I was struck by something, I believe it was Preston Taylor, who described the racial unity as an acid test for gospel commitment, and the heresy of heresies he talked about. And to me, that issue is such an important one and so significant. I think of, to tack on to what you just said about being correct, that many in our movement, and probably in other movements as well, have a variety of other acid tests as well, that so many other things also become a litmus test or an acid test for if I can stay at this church and be a part of this community. And, on that note, I was struck by what N.L. Clark said, that the idea that people should separate because they disagree has been the prolific source of all the divisions that have cursed the earth. And so I kind of want to ask you this question as an elder who's also a historian, but certainly in your work as an elder at the Minter Lane Church. What would be your advice to elders and ministers who are attempting to identify and undermine the effect of this curse in their churches? That if I disagree, I can't stay. To those who believe that everything is an acid test for my ability to be here. And for those who say, if you do this, I have to leave, like in good conscience, I can't stay. How does the elder and minister respond to that in faithfulness to the roots of our movement and to these people?
Yeah, you didn't give me any softball questions, did you? I think that I'll just speak a little bit from my own experience. One of the issues that has been very volatile among our churches in recent years, and in many churches, has been the issue of the full inclusion of female Christians to allow them to use the gifts that they have been given, gifts of leadership and others in the leadership of the church, even as they are given those opportunities otherwise to use their talents, the talents that God has given them for the building up of the church. And I remember that in one occasion, the Minter Lane had begun 30 years ago, including women at certain levels of leadership in the public worship service, reading scripture and so forth. And there was a man who was very, very opposed to this, and he called me aside, and we met during the Sunday school class time. He wanted to talk about it right then. He was just so upset about seeing a woman. Again, I don't remember specifics right now. Probably read a scripture during the service and was just really, really upset because he believed that this was violating something that was inherently part of what Christians should observe, that God had set these things in place. And the only thing, you can't give somebody a lecture. I could say things that I believed, and I could say them from my understanding of Scripture and my understanding of the nature of God and the church. But I think, and it was very, very hard for me. It was extremely hard. But he was pretty agitated, and to respond in a way that was, I tried to be, and I don't know if I succeeded or not, but I tried to be gentle and clear. I tried to keep my mouth shut as much as possible to allow him to speak and to say what was on his heart. And I think that I'm not holding myself up as a perfect example of things like this, but I'm just giving you an experience that I had. I think that if it had been handled slightly differently, if I had come back in his face in a way that would have been personally at the level he was coming into my face, I think he and some others would have left the congregation immediately. We parted on good terms. He understood clearly what I believed, that if there was any place on this earth where God's kingdom, the full manifestation of the kingdom, where there is no male and female, should be visible. If there's any place on this imperfect earth it should be visible, it should be the church. And I didn't convince him. And I think eventually they decided to go elsewhere. But when there are things that are so deeply held, I think that you have to respect that. I think you have to challenge it, but you have to challenge it in a way that would reflect the fruit of the Spirit, an attitude of the fruit of the Spirit, rather than come right back with a barrage of lecture material. I think it's a matter of studying. I think it's a matter of spiritual formation. I wish elders, including our own, could spend more time, rather than doing business in elders' meetings, just spending an hour in spiritual disciplines, and not prayer as we sometimes normally think about it, but prayer more in the great tradition of Christianity, of sometimes just sitting before God together, and especially when there are times of crisis, when there are times of divisive attitudes that are flaring up. And we've done that. We've had some retreats where we just went and spent time in spiritual disciplines. I personally think that it's really good to know some of the things we've talked about today, that you are not being unfaithful, so to speak, to our own commitments and our own heritage to emphasize these things about peace and unity. But I think it's also going to have to be maybe more than understanding and getting people's quotes like today. At least as much, it's going to have to be that spiritual formation of creating an attitude of peace and unity.
One of the things that I think could be a experience of a person working towards peace and unity, which I think you can speak to better than most because this has been a lifelong journey for you, is you can listen to our history and you can read these quotes and you can be very aware of how we've continued to struggle for this, and we've gotten off the path, and sometimes we get back on, and we get off the path, and sometimes we stay off the path. And there is one way to read that history and experience that history as a leader and get maybe cynical, get angry, get passive, which I think is always a struggle of ministry, because sometimes you seem like you are fighting the same battles over and over. And so I would love to know, from your perspective as professor, elder, church leader, how have you and how would you encourage those of us who want to continue to prioritize peace and unity, continue to emphasize that part of our history? How have you kept hope and energy and motivation over the long haul, if that question makes sense?
Sure. Yeah, it reminds me when I taught for many years, I taught the undergraduate restoration history course at ACU. And it was really interesting to see at the beginning of the class, early on, when we saw all of those great calls for unity, like Thomas Campbell's and Barton Stone's. And then we get a little bit farther along in the course, and the students would get really enthused about these things. They'd, of course, never heard it. They didn't have any idea that this tradition had that kind of impulse. And when we got to the parts where people started fighting and the divisions began to take shape, sometimes there would be a great letdown, a great disappointment. And I think the tendency, as you described it, Wilson, was towards cynicism, towards saying, well, you can't do it. This movement is inherently flawed and we're just never going to get anywhere with it. I think, and I had to start warning students early in the course, yes, experience the exhilaration, experience the excitement about these calls for unity that are part of us, that are part of our tradition, that are part of our heritage, that are part of what Christ wants for the church. But be prepared, as you already know in your own personal life in so many other kinds of ways, challenges, and there are going to be disappointments, and there are going to be heartbreaks, and there are going to be times when you are very discouraged, disillusioned, even depressed. I certainly can attest to that. And yet, I think that, again, being immersed in some way in a regular set of spiritual practices, spiritual disciplines, keeping you grounded individually as well as with others of like mind, gives you a spiritual energy and ability to maintain the course, to stay the course, to be consistent. Disappointments will come. There's just no question. And even when you start getting down to some of those red flag issues or those explosive issues that come up in congregations, there are going to be disappointments. And frankly, you can't control other people. But with a deep commitment, even in the midst of the disappointments, even in the midst sometimes of what seem to be constant defeats, to be consistent over time, and especially as you are personally and with others of like mind grounded in the spiritual disciplines and continue to have the spiritual support of others, it's going to have an effect in the long run. I think that over a long period of time, even if you don't see a lot of effect in your own life, I'm not sure if I can even give a lot of examples of this, but people like T.B. Larimore, for example, who in many ways was an utter failure. He constantly called for people to not let these issues be divisive and hurtful and breaking people into groups that were shouting at each other and condemning each other. And in a real way, in some ways of looking at it, he was a failure, and yet he was not a failure. His voice continues to speak powerfully to a lot of people. I'm actually doing a different session in the summit that's focusing only on T.B. Larimore, so he's kind of on my mind. And I don't know, there's just no way to avoid disappointment. There's no way to avoid sometimes even being depressed about it all, but having that spiritual reservoir that you can fall back on and have others of like mind to continue to hold you up as well as being personally in the spiritual disciplines. I think that's absolutely essential. If you don't have it, I think you can become cynical and just say, forget it. I'm getting out of here. I'm getting out of this body, this church, this movement, these folks, and maybe even out of Christianity as a whole. I've seen it tragically in several cases.
Eric, I think we have time for maybe one more question. Do you have anything that you want to ask before we wrap things up?
You brought up T.B. Larimore, and I was struck by what you said about his resistance to addressing some of the more contentious issues. And I guess as you think about that response from Larimore in his time, and you think about the current pressure upon congregational leaders to address publicly many contentious issues and where we stand on this. Do you think Larimore was right? Would you, on what, how does a leader decide this is something I have to address and this is something that's not worth it?
Yeah. That's a great question, Eric, and I really appreciate you bringing it up because I think it's essential to talk about. The issues that Larimore was dealing with were the ones that we're familiar with if you know anything about the history of the movement in the first major division. So can you use instrumental music in worship? Can you have any kind of extra congregational organization that allows churches to cooperate to do mission work or other kinds of things, care for orphans, print material? Is it worth having these gatherings, these conventions, like what we would even call a summit or a lectureship in the past in some cases? Can you raise money outside of the Sunday morning contribution? I mean, there were a number of these things. The ones that we normally think of are the Missionary Society and instrumental music. And I think what he says in that statement where he says, when I was baptized thousands and thousands of people, and he said, every time I hold their hand in mine and ask them to, for the good confession, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, your Savior, etc. So I didn't ask them, do you believe it's okay to use instrumental music in worship? Do you believe it's okay to have a missionary society and support out from the congregation's treasury? I think those issues are of a different nature than some other issues. I think there are some issues like the issue of race. In my opinion, I think that is not of the same nature. This is an issue about the very nature of God, about the very nature of Christ, who came to break down the barriers that sin has erected. And so he didn't talk about that. I mean, he should have. Christians were just as responsible for seeing the kinds of things that were not right in the divisions in the church that separated and in many cases completely put out of sight in a lot of ways Black Christians, Black population. Whites were sometimes eager to have Black evangelists to evangelize Black Christians, but to establish separate churches so that they would not be part of their churches. I don't think that's of the same nature at all. I think these are issues that speak to the very nature of what Christianity is about, what the nature of God is, and how we should reflect that nature and the nature of Christ in our lives. I think that there are better ways than others of addressing these issues, perhaps, if you become hateful and take on the very works of the flesh that negate God's nature and the nature of the church in advocating, then that's where we sometimes can fall into a trap. And I know I have felt that, to become very, very almost hateful, I think, sometimes, because And that's another area that I've read about and thought about and worked in and written about for a couple of decades at least. And so I really get impatient, I think, with other white people. Why can't you see this? Why can't you see the evils of white supremacy? But I guess what I would say, Eric, is I think in the context in which Larimore was speaking and the things that he was dealing with, I think he was right. Those are just inconsequential things, quite frankly. When there are consequential things that are about the very nature of who we are as followers of Jesus, you can't remain silent.
Thanks, Dr. Foster. I'm so grateful for you and for what you've shared with us today. Wilson, do you want to close us up?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Dr. Foster, for your time, but not just your time, the content and the heart with which you presented it. I know has made a big difference in my life and in Eric's life and in the life of many students and many others within our movement and other movements. So I just want to say a big thank you for that. And I want to thank Eric for asking the hard questions so that I could ask some of those easier questions. He does better at that. But I really just want to give a big thank you to everyone who has tuned in and is listening in and learning from these different presentations. I'm confident that not just with the content from Dr. Foster, but also our conversation, there is a variety of big takeaways that I think we can carry with us as church leaders. And that's really what we want our particular pathway and each of these tracks to be about, is that you as a church leader can feel equipped and encouraged and empowered to continue to try to be a peacemaker and help by the power of the Spirit to form communities of peacemaking and unity. And so I just want to wish you all well as you tune in and continue to try to do that. We are really grateful that you would be a part of our pathway, and we want to encourage you to consider checking out some of our other tracks in the congregational leadership pathway. But there's a variety of great offerings that will be made available. Dr. Foster alluded to another pathway he's going to be a part of. So if you'll just go to acusummit.org, you can find out more information there. You can find out ways to access content and hopefully can find something of benefit and value there. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of the day.